With your approval, I'm going to use you as a group, and I want to elicit some information from you. But we'll get there in due course. I should actually acknowledge the three institutions that have been involved in this work, which has been ongoing since about 2005, 2006, in one form or another. I aim to overview our work incorporating human values into catchment conservation planning. We've done 5 catchments in the southwest of Western Australia, and we've also done a pilot exercise with the Thames Estuary Partnership in the UK, which was quite interesting. I'm going to focus on, it's a big topic, I'm only going to focus on a few things. Firstly, I want to focus on defining and classifying values. Secondly, I want to look at eliciting values under a resource-poor environment, which we normally are. And I want to actually do an exercise with you, as I said, with your approval. It'll be anonymous, there are no threats involved, there are no scoring, it's not part of anything. It'll be an interesting exercise, and I'll be able to feed the results back to you later. And then I will look at finish up by looking at some of the outputs today. The first question is, why the interest in values in the first place? Well, firstly, the choice of priority human values will profoundly affect the required type, amount and structure of natural resources that you require in terms of management. Now, maybe that linkage is not intuitive to you, but I hope by the end of the session it is. And if there was nothing else you took away, that would probably be the one thing I'd like you to take away. Whatever you choose as your priority values will affect what you need to manage in terms of natural resources. Now, I say natural resources in general, but I'm actually going to focus largely on biological resources. And if I talk about biological elements, I mean the biological things in systems. Secondly, if you look at the literature in general, you can interpret it. I think it's fairly accepted that human values, which can be variously described, determine human well-being. So if you believe that decisions should be made in terms of delivering ultimately human well-being, then human values become very important. And finally, from a much more personal perspective, and I've been involved in natural resource management in Western Australia since 1978, I think the importance of natural resources, particularly biological resources, has been underrated because the values analyses have been much too narrow. And I think biological conservation people, and I'm one of them, have been particularly bad in that regard. So it's not recording, is it, Maxim? The general pattern, the general frame that underlies this sort of work, and this is actually drawn really from the ecosystem services literature, which is probably the most, in terms of volume, is the biggest literature dealing certainly with the biological sciences and perhaps natural resources more widely. And this is the sort of general pattern that you'll see that's lying behind their framework. Even if you go back to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, 2005, the biodiversity synthesis, for example, this is the sort of diagram you'll see as the framework underpinning it, where they're saying that the processes, we manage the processes in systems, or we deal with the processes in systems, be it precipitation, erosion, physiological processes, the nitrogen cycle, human behavioural processes. People forget that behavioural processes of humans are just the processes in systems. We manage those things in one form or another to deliver a set of benefits or values which, depending on what that mix is, will give us a sense of well-being, or various levels of well-being. So that's the underlying frame that sits under much of the work. And as I said, it's really, this has very much been in the ecosystem services domain, but it underlies the other sort of work I've seen in terms of total economic value and so on, coming out of the OECD. If we look at a more complex picture, this is the same basic categories with one added. This came out of the work by Mason Bateman. The UK have done a national ecosystem assessment, which they're still producing a huge volume of papers out of that work. And Ian Bateman, who was here, is one of the authors of this work, and he was here two years ago, giving a lecture. And this framework is still current. I've seen it in their 2014 publications. If you look from the left-hand side, the processes, so they're saying the same sorts of things. We have a set of processes, and this is only a subset, obviously. There's a set of processes which we manage to deliver something in terms of what they're calling final ecosystem services. Now, these are all processes, we don't have a problem. If you look at this category, you start running your eye down this list and you start to see problems. At the top, you've got crops, livestock, fish, trees, and so on. Now, they're natural biological elements of systems. no argument about that. Water supply, quite ambiguous. Depending on how you phrase water supply, it's either a process or it's actually a thing. It's a physical element. Then you get into a set of things that are actually regulation. Now, they're quite clearly processes. So you've now got a mixture of two different entities, the physical things in systems and the processes in systems. This is problematic. And it gets even worse when you get, particularly, this leads to a lot of double counting if you try to use it in decision-making processes. It's quite clear that pollination affects all the things you've got at the top of the list, for example. So you've now got a problem. And it gets worse. While species diversity is actually a descriptive term, it's really a description of an element in a system. It's about its diversity. So you've now got, in philosophical terms, you've now got three different entities being mixed up at the same level in a classification. If you try and apply that in decision processes where you're trying to do trade-offs and look at synergies, you're going to end up with all sorts of double counting problems. And in economics terms, that should be quite clear to you. So that's obviously a problematic classification. If you go and look at the next column, which is they've called goods in this work, it's really almost a synonym for benefits and values. You've got the same sorts of problems that have been transferred across to the end column. If you use this sort of a classification, it's had other things added that are values, what I would call values, and other people would call values. So you've now had another category of things mixed up with all these other things in the same classification. So if you're interested in decisions and you're wanting to trade things off and you're wanting to look at synergies, then you really do need to, this is problematic, quite highly problematic. If you look at the total economic value concept, which as far as I'm aware came out of Peirce's work with the OECD, probably starting around 2003. I don't want to dwell on this diagram because I want to look at something a bit more positive. But if you look at the bottom line, you'll see the same sorts of problems. It's a mixed classification and there are problems in it. Both these sorts of work, the ecosystem services work, the total economic value work, it's got a lot to offer in terms of information and ideas. All I'm saying is their classifications are not ones you could apply, well, you can apply them in decision-making processes, but do so at your own risk. Most of the people I've talked to who have tried have come up with issues and problems. Sometimes they don't even know why they've got a problem, but you've got a lot of problems in terms of double counting and so on. So if I could just summarise across what I've seen in my reading about human values and natural resource management, particularly I must say in terms of biological conservation over the last 15 years, this is what I would say. I would say that human values in natural resource management are widely acknowledged as important to planning, but in practice they're poorly defined and classified. Secondly, I'd say they're poorly integrated with planning. It's not that some people don't. Some of the marine science plans, for example, certainly take good cognizance of values, but it's not a full set of values, and it's not, and I wouldn't say it's fully integrated with planning either. Thirdly, values are often elicited just as intuitive responses, which in certain research contexts is fine, is what you want to do, but rather than within a consistent framework of language or concepts. However, if you're like us, we're working with groups of stakeholders from different backgrounds in a decision-making situation or decision advice situation. It's really important that if we're going to set priorities in that context, moving on to the last point, that the stakeholders need to have a shared language and set of concepts. We actually want there to be information symmetry in our group, and we don't want there to be any linguistic ambiguity. You need to, if you've got information asymmetry or linguistic ambiguity, as comes when people have got different definitions of terms, and I can assure you in my world, people have got widely different definitions of the same terms. We actually spend, for the elicitation type exercise and some of the way I'm going through this with you today, we would take 6 hours to do this with a group before we do or 5 or 6 hours before we do the elicitation. With the Thames Estuary Partnership, we actually spent a whole workshop, 6-hour workshop, just getting terminology and understandings correct. Because otherwise you're taking an enormous, once you go into the elicitation process, you're taking an enormous array of information asymmetry into it if you don't get those things sorted out in the language. So how did we go about doing it? How did we define values? Because there are many. And understanding that we want some sort of final endpoints that we can trade off in the process. So we're really interested in allocation of resources amongst particular endpoints is what we want to do. So for us, values are about the ultimate preferred end states of human existence. For example, adequate food resources, meaningful occupation. And if we go back to the psychological literature, this definition is actually based out of a guy called Rockach. I don't know what was in the water in 1973, but you had Rockach and Maslow, and I'm sure you've all heard of Maslow, if not Rockach. Both produced what I think were really important books in this general area. And the first 100 pages of both those books, if anyone's interested in this sort of topic, I would recommend as reading. Rockach, and this is an adaptation of Rockach's, and there's some things left out which if we had time at the end I would come back to. Taken from Rockach, values are enduring beliefs concerning the ultimate preferred end states of human existence. Now this is really important because it underlines that the values we're talking about aren't just simple attitudes which change from day to day potentially. These are enduring beliefs, so they're fairly stable. Not that they can't change, just that they're fairly stable. The other thing is that they're beliefs. So once we start looking at sets of values and eliciting people's ratings of importance of those values, science can't help you. Science can give you the techniques to rate them and make sure you understand the consequences of your ratings, but the actual ratings themselves are highly subjective. Science can never tell you what things should come first. They can only tell you the consequences of your decision, which is a really important point that a lot of people make mistakes over. So, and when we look at the values classification in a second, it's the set of end states. It is a classification of the set of end states that we see as leading to human well-being, such as health, adequate food resources, philosophical contentment, etc. And we use those endpoints themselves as the surrogates of values. So we don't want to be saying continuously, this is the enduring belief that. So we use the actual endpoint to represent the value. And our underlying principle is that achievement of a particular set of values will give you physical and mental health, which is human well-being. The other thing that's evolved over the last 10 or 15 years, particularly in the work that I've been doing, is if you're going to have a robust classification of values, then you really need a set of explicit criteria underpinning them. And it's inordinately difficult to find such a set of criteria in the literature, something that's surprised me intensely, in fact. This set of criteria is actually based more out of the multi-criteria analysis literature, and Mark Bergman rewrote some criteria that Roy developed in that area, and then I've added other criteria as they go along. So when we look at a values classification, we try and drive it using these criteria. Firstly, that it should be readily understood by users. That's straightforward, particularly when you're dealing with multiple stakeholders. It needs to be readily recognised. Secondly, that it's exhaustive in that there is a value category for each benefit to be allocated. I think that's fairly reasonable. Thirdly, it's redundancy minimising. That's a horrible term. I need to find another term. But you need to have a minimum, you need to try and eradicate any redundancy amongst the categories in the classification. That is, each benefit to be classified fits only within one value category. For example, food, which I would treat as a benefit coming out of a system, fits only in the adequate resources category of values. If you don't meet that criteria, you will get double counting, and it will make it very difficult to do any addition and trading off amongst the values. And that third criterion is the one, is probably the equal, if not the most problematic in the classifications I've looked at. It's certainly a problem in every ecosystem services classification I've seen. The fourth point is that it's consistent in that components at the same level within the classification of the same type. That is quite an important concept, and I'm going to come back to that one, so park that. And finally, the values need to be scalable, so they can be applied across the full range of space and time that you're looking at in any sort of analysis. So, for example, the values need to speak to us as individuals potentially, but also to groups, to regions, to states, nations. The world might be a bit far, but it needs to be scalable on those terms so that you can start building up across different groups. It needs to be scalable across spatial scales as well. So it needs to be applicable whether you're looking at a hectare or the total biota of the Southwest Land Division, for example. The classification we use is on the left-hand side. And what I've done is I've just popped those classification criteria I mentioned to you in the bottom right. In a minute, I'm going to go through these one by one quickly because I want to describe them, and then I want to elicit from you how you would rate the importance of these values in the context of a given set of biological entities, which I'll describe for you. So that's where I'm headed. The way this classification's been developed, it's not a total classification of values for life. This is a classification of values coming out of natural resources, and in particular biological resources. And from this point on, I'll just talk about biological resources to simplify it. So there are things that are missing from a total value set, and that's quite deliberate. The things that don't relate to natural resources have been omitted. I've been through the literature, including all the stuff that you've already seen, the ecosystem services literature, the total economic valuation literature. I've read Maslow, Rockich, Nussbaum, Amartya Sen, a whole lot of people. And I've taken anything that I think that I can define as an endpoint value from all that work and put it into a list, which isn't to say you won't find anything missing. And you'll see at the top I've got classification example. When working with stakeholder groups, we check the classification with them and make sure there's nothing missing as we go through. But I do want to come back to how do we decide if these things are all the same type of thing? Because I think it's actually quite important. And that they're the same type because they all conform to the following three statements. We can say about each one of these things, I have an enduring belief that any one of those things, meaningful occupation and so on, is a desirable ultimate endpoint of existence. That statement makes sense. You may not give it a high rating, but the statement makes sense. Secondly, each one of those things is influenced by the composition and structure of biological elements in systems. So they're all, how you manage biological elements in a system can influence every one of those values. And hopefully that'll come out when I go through the examples in a minute. Thirdly, I would argue that everything in that list represents the penultimate end to a set of why questions where the penultimate answer is human well-being. So these should be the ultimate answer to a question, the penultimate answer to a question leading to well-being. For example, if I say to you, why do you work? And you say to me, I want money, that's obviously not an endpoint. Money's a means to an end, it's not an end. So if I then say, why do you want money? And you say, I want food, well, it might be eggs to throw at someone. So I would then say, okay, why do you want food? And if they say, well, I want to maintain my energy and structure, then you've got adequate resources on this list. So that's an endpoint leading to well-being. So what I'd like to do now is just go through each one of these items, and then I actually do want to elicit from you a response to a set of values. I want to get you to rate some values in relationship to a set of biological elements, because I think it's actually the best way to see how it works. So I'll go through these quickly because I think they are fairly intuitive, but at the end I will stop just for a second, because to do the elicitation you do need to be comfortable with the general categories. The first one is access to knowledge heritage, which the definition is just access to the wealth of knowledge, including heritage knowledge embodied in biological elements. For example, biological communities in nature reserves are often used as school resources for education. Genomes are a knowledge bank. Research on natural systems to understand how to manage other systems and so on. In 1978, I came back, I'm a West Australian by birth, and I was brought up on a farm. In 1978, I was on a plane coming back to Western Australia to go for an interview, and it was very foresighted of me at 28, because I wasn't all that organised. I actually thought on the plane the sort of questions I might get asked in the interview. So I wrote, and I thought one of the questions I might get is, why is nature conservation important? I was going for a fisheries and wildlife job. So I wrote down a list. There was a very poor version of the list that I've already showed you. My brother, at that stage, who was alive, was a farmer. And before I went to the interview, I thought I'd just test this list on him. And he looked at this whole list, and the only one that appealed to him was heritage value. The only one. And he was a sensitive New Age guy. He wasn't a redneck farmer at all. And I was actually stunned. I was not asked the question at the interview, and I thought it was such a good question that I spent another 20 or 30 years asking a lot of people that question. At one stage I had to stop asking the question because it wasn't discriminating anything amongst the candidates in a position application. It is the single worst answered question in an interview I have ever asked. And I asked it a lot over 10, 20 years. I sort of asked it for a while and I thought, this is useless, doesn't discriminate anything, it's all poorly answered. And then I went, well, it's sort of interesting to ask it anyway. So I stopped for a while and I asked it again, and it was still poorly answered. And I think it was an indictment of all of us who have got any sort of ability in a senior position in helping people understand things, that here we were trying to employ people to work in nature conservation, but they didn't really have a particularly good understanding of why that was important. And we used to pose the bar question. If you were sitting at a bar with a farmer and the farmer said, why is nature conservation important, what would you say? I mean, to be honest with you, it's a shit of a question. And it's not actually that easy to answer. But it was interesting that it was so poorly answered. Anyway, so I've really digressed. Sorry about that. Adequate resources is having sufficient food, oxygen and drinking water to support our bodily energetic needs. And things like kangaroos and fish, molluscs, natural biological elements for foods, very obvious. But we also look at these things in a secondary sense, so that the vegetation in the paddock may actually contribute to the hydrological performance of the crop in some way, or form a stock protection value to give you higher production of food. So we would then count that as natural biological elements contributing to adequate resources. And that's exactly what we do. And in fact, some of the farmers in all of our stakeholder groups have got farmers on. For some of them, that's actually gets quite a high score, because they see the nature reserves in their systems as helping to control the salinity in their systems, and therefore their food production. And firewood for cooking is another example. Aesthetically pleasing environment is an environment where the composition and arrangement of elements gives pleasure in and of itself. So an endpoint in and of itself, the pleasure people get from that. And we include sounds and smells in that, by the way. I think that's fairly straightforward and obvious, but there is some really good research out of Europe which actually shows that even the biological richness, which is a property of that element, of a grassland, they looked at grasslands with variable richness, and they assessed people on how this is just members of the public, not botanists, they assessed how people rated it as being aesthetically pleasing. And people were intuitively picking up the diversity. So the increasingly rich grasslands were rated higher for aesthetic value. And to be honest, I was stunned, because it's not that easy to pick up diversity in grasslands. So that's that's a classic example of how the structure and composition of the element can affect the value delivery. A benign physical environment is an environment in which the physical and chemical constituents are conducive to good health. The most obvious example in the agricultural zone is shade and shelter from retained native vegetation around homesteads and sheep yards. An example that fascinates me was if you think about the lead poisoning in Esperance, the trigger for people realising there was a problem was the diversity of native birds falling out of the air. Well, the diversity of native birds that were sick and dying. If the native birds hadn't been there, then there would have been humans. Would have been the first sign that there was a lead pollution problem in Esperance. And even the chairman of the select committee that looked at the whole process was stunned and said something in his summary like, God, even in this modern age, we are dependent upon seeing these deaths in the diversity of birds to know that we've got a problem. So biological diversity is one thing that is a bioindicator of things going wrong in our physical environment. Meaningful occupation is employment that provides our lives with a sense of purpose. And it doesn't have to be paid, but it's not recreation. And I think most people can discriminate between recreation and meaningful occupation. There are very few souls who actually run those two things together in their lives. And I'm a living example of that. Most of my life, since 1978, my work has been only occurred because we've got natural biological elements in the southwest of Western Australia. And you can think of plenty of examples where people draw a meaningful occupation from natural resources. Protection from other organisms, protection from disease, organisms and predators, including dangerous humans. The mallees that you see before you are probably not the right sort, but if you could turn them into spears or a nulla, that's an example of biological elements truly being a resource for protection from other humans. More commonly, it would probably be the leaves. I'm actually quite amazed at the amount of times that eucalyptus oil or melaleuca oil is used as a medicine. And there'd be other examples of medicines coming out of our natural biological elements. We get some quite interesting examples from our our stakeholders when we do this exercise. One farmer actually said, it's the behaviour of native birds that tells me whether I've got snakes around my house or my yards. And he saw that as quite a useful value. And there are many others. Recreational satisfaction, I think, is straightforward. Everyone's aware of that. There's plenty of studies that show a strong relationship between recreation in outdoor environments and physical and mental health. Spiritual philosophical contentment. All humans have a set of spiritual or philosophical beliefs that establish and explain their role in the world universe or provide guidance for how we live our lives and how we interact with other organisms and indeed the inanimate world as well. Even if it's not very spelled out or explicit, I don't think there's any person that doesn't have a set of philosophical beliefs that sits behind what they're doing. And the degree to which those philosophical beliefs are met from their daily life will give them a greater or lesser set of contentment. In the biological conservation world, a lot of the scientists and managers have a very strong either biodiversity ethic or belief in it, or belief in intrinsic values, and this is where we would put those sort of people. This is where those sort of people would score or rate that value for importance. And finally, future options value is not really, if you think about it a bit, it's not really a value in the sense, it doesn't really meet the criteria I talked about before. Future options value, these are the values listed previously that are not currently realised, but we may like to in the future. When we're dealing with sets of nature reserves, for example, and we're planning for them, and we're dealing with a stakeholder group, it may be that people just want the stuff left alone. They may not want to talk about what values they should be taking out of it now. They may not want to rate the value and importance of the area now. They may wish to say, I would want to keep the option for myself or my children to rate those values into the future. As I said, it's not strictly speaking a value in the sense of the criteria, but we need to have that value listed. It's an important component of what people want to rate us in terms of importance. The sorts of things, for example, a germplasm resource in rare plants, but areas for future leisure needs. I know in the eastern wheatbelt there's reserves of, I can think of the Dragon Rocks Nature Reserve, 32,000 hectares. It is a nature reserve. It's effectively there for strictly conservation, biodiversity, ethic values at this stage. But I've got no doubt that in all things being, unless something dramatically changes, in 10, 15, 20 years' time, that will become a major resource for other things, for other values, a future option. People, for the elicitation, I'll explain how to do the elicitation in a minute. But what I'll do is you'll have the set of the definitions on the back of a page to do the elicitation. I need to ask first whether people are happy to do it. It'll only take 5 minutes. Yep. The process we use is it's really clear that if if you're going to rate values, you need to rate the values coming out of something. So I have to give you a set of biological elements to think about when you're rating the importance of the values coming from them. And I need to set a spatial and temporal scale to do the rating over. And obviously I need to give you the question. But it's important that I set those other scenes, otherwise you'll all have different things in mind. And we spend a lot of time getting those things straight with our stakeholders group, by the way. For this exercise today, the natural resource under consideration is all the natural biological elements of the southwest agricultural zone. Mammals, birds, reptiles, frogs, plants, invertebrates, everything. Bacteria, everything. And irrespective of where they occur, whether it's on private property, national parks or state forests. And we do that, that's how we do the exercise ourselves. We do it tenure-free, completely tenure-free. So that's the elements I want you to rate. And just to make sure the constraints are clear, the timescale I want you to think about is 25 years. So I'm going to ask you to rate the importance of each of these values coming out of those biological elements over the next 25 years. So I've given you a spatial scale. Oh, by the way, 25 years because it's cross-generational. That's the time scale we generally use with our values ratings, and it's about the length of time we think you can reasonably pretend you can plan for without getting ridiculous. Some of the natural cycles we're dealing with are over 100 years, so that's an issue that has to be borne in mind. And it's also cross-generational, so people are forced to think about their children at least. So timescale 25 years, the spatial scale Southwest Ag Zone is effectively from Kalbarri to Southern Cross to just east of Esperance at Cape Barrett, south and east of that line. And the question I'd like you to answer in relationship to each of the values is from the perspective of the West Australian public's wellbeing, how important is obtaining value X from the defined natural biological elements? Are people comfortable with that, or are there questions that people want to ask? What I want to do is do the elicitation. Normally I'd have someone else working with us and we can often feed back the results quite quickly. I can't do that today, but I will feed back the results to the group later.
Shall I go get some pens for people who don't know?
Yeah, Maximus being very efficient. The other thing is I need to show you how to fill out the form. The scoring technique is that you'll have a scale, because we wanted to have a continuous evaluation scale going from 0 to 100, where 0 is no importance, 100 is great importance. We'd like you to put a dot on that scale, which is your best estimate, and then put an ellipse around that dot, which shows where your uncertainty lies. So what's the lowest you think the value could actually be, and what's the highest importance, I should say. And just to give you another example, when we're doing these examples with stakeholders, it's really clear that we can't use any values in the analysis, otherwise we run a severe risk of anchoring the stakeholders inadvertently to some statement. So for example, I believe the importance of eating fruit for my health is very high. And I'm actually, in actual reality, I'm quite confident about that. So very narrow ellipse around that bound. The importance of eating dark chocolate for my health is a more ambiguous sort of thing. I actually really like chocolate, anyone that knows me. So that's problematic. But this is dark chocolate, so it's got antioxidant values. We know it's true. Cadbury's did research and told us. So you've got to believe that. So my best estimate is down here somewhere. It's not great for me, but it's not terrible. And in all reality, my certainty is pretty not so flash. So there's a fairly wide set of bounds around my certainty on that. So that's the scoring process. Please, there are no negative relationships. It's not that you couldn't accommodate them in this process. It's just we're not using negative relationships. The dot must be inside the ellipse. You'll understand that. It's a continuous scale, so it's up to you entirely where the ends of the ellipse go. You will make my task easier if you touch one of the ticks with your ellipses, so I don't have to start guessing in between the two ticks. I'm not sure that's a good thing to say when you're a continuous scale. Never mind. So people comfortable to do it? show you some results from the Thames Estuary work, just as much I've done. So I think it won't take about copyright. The questions at the top, the definition of the values is on the back. I want to do this exercise with a group of engineers as well. If people can do it in 5, well, I suggest you do it quite intuitively, to be honest. Just adopt where your best estimate. So this is how important. Remember, it's for the public of Western Australia, not your personal perspective. So you're the Premier of Western Australia making a decision about the importance of these values in relationship to the biological elements I define. How are people going? Let your intuition run riot. People happy if I move on? Right, so just to finish up, I really want to look at some of the results because they really are quite fascinating. The fact that people are being asked to express their best estimate and their uncertainty on a continuous scale gives us quite a rich set of information. And I hope you'll agree once we show you the outputs from the work we've got. Just a quick, I'm not the mathematician. The Nottingham people are computer scientists and they do the mathematics. The actual mathematics of manipulating this data is done in fuzzy mathematics. I'm not your man. I can give you a reference to, if you want to understand that, and certainly Christian Wagner, the professor or associate professor who's involved, is a really friendly sort of person who I hope to get out here one day. But basically, if you think of if three stakeholders have rated the same thing, all that happens is that the overlap between them is accumulated as a histogram at the bottom. So if you look at the 9 to 10 score, for example, there's only one person that's put, so one block that's put a score in that area.
So you don't have to use the best bet, and you just use the ellipse.
We use everything. In fact, the paper that we're trying to get published at the moment compares the best bet with the centroid. You can run, the equivalent of the mean for this is a centroid, which effectively gives you the centre of gravity of it. So we get the centroid of this, we get the best estimate, and we've also done, when I very first started doing this in 2000, the very first elicitation I did was extremely crude in 2006, but it's actually in the plan for the Bunteen Marching Natural History Recovery Catchment. And we just ranked it. We just used straight rank order, fixed rank order, to do the process for the first 2 or 3 times. And this is and we compared that as well. So all those 3 approaches are compared in the paper that's hopefully going to be published in the Journal of Environmental Management. So yes, we do use the best estimate, but I won't show that today. With the TEMS, we actually got them to do the rating of the importance of the values, both from their stakeholder perspective and their personal perspective. We do stakeholder perspective first on the assumption that we want them to think about their stakeholders, and then they'll quite easily default to their personal perspective if it's different. I'm not saying there aren't alternative arguments, I'm just saying that's the way we argued it. The only other thing you really need to know is that, and it doesn't really matter that much, but this was the first time we looked at things that weren't just biological elements. The Thames estuary has things like flood barriers and so on in it, so that the elements, the set of elements we were looking at included both abiotic and biotic elements, and we were interested to see if that was going to be problematic. And it wasn't really. Well, not in the context of the pilot study. There were 12 people. They represented government agencies and they represented yachting groups and all sorts of interest groups on the Thames. So this is 12 people. If we look at the adequate resources straight away, you can see, and I should emphasise, going this way on the graphs along the x-axis, as you increase, with increasing on the x-axis, you're getting increasing importance being ascribed to the value. On the y-axis, as we go up that way, we're getting increasing agreement amongst the group. Incidentally, we could actually compare them. The ratings are anonymous, but we know their rating both from their personal perspective and from their stakeholder perspective. So, for example, there's a number, the same number on the person's sheets, but not their name. So if we wanted to, we could start analysing that as well. We haven't done that. Straight away, you can see with the adequate resources, you can see that the level of agreement is almost bimodal in the sense. Now, if this was going to come up as a high value for management, as a manager, you would know straight away you've got a problem with your group. That the level of agreement's bimodal. There's likely to be 2 quite distinct sets of views, and it's something that needs to be managed. Whereas with the importance of value health, and this was the benign physical and chemical environment, we've changed the name to the one I gave you today because we feel it's a more descriptive name. So this is a benign physical chemical environment. You can see there's a high level of importance and a high level of agreement ascribed to that value. And that's one of the ones that comes out in the top 3 or 4. I'll go on to the next, and I want to show you the next one. This one brings out, once again, the bimodal ones fascinate me. Because at Lake Bride we got bimodal on, I think it was adequate resource value, and bimodal on the spiritual philosophical. And I'd almost bet that's a agricultural farmer whatever divide. The other interesting thing was when we showed that bimodal result to the group, because all these results go back to the stakeholder group obviously, a person that better not be named, a person actually said, oh, that's not right, when they saw this, the spiritual one had this sort of almost the same as that, but even shifted further this way. This person said, oh, that's not right, and then he went, and then he suddenly realised that there was no such thing as right or wrong. This is what it is. So it's actually really, it's a good learning exercise for it. I've done about 8 or 9 of these, and I've never not enjoyed doing it.
Doesn't this depend on sample size? But if you have 2 people, by definition, you get a bimodal response.
Well, not necessarily. No, you won't by definition get bimodal with 2 people. They might both agree with each other.
Yeah. If they didn't overlap. But I mean, presumably as the sample size increases, you're less likely to see a separation.
Why? Because in fact they're not on these graphs.
Sample bias. Reduce sample bias with a big sample, that's all.
Right.
Yeah, maybe the population doesn't have the bimodal, but you might see one.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, obviously this is going to have sample bias in it for sure. I suspect that it's actually the stuff I've just described. I think is quite a real reflection of a much bigger sample. I think it's very indicative actually of what my experience of 30 years of dealing with agricultural people is. So, but the sample size is an issue, but in fact in natural resource management we're often dealing with committees of 12, 14, 15 giving opinions and making decisions. So I think it's a quite real world, it is a real world situation.
Then you've
So,
got the full population.
pardon?
Then you're dealing with the full population of decision makers. So if there's a bimodal, it's really bimodal. It's not
Yes. So, yeah.
How do you take out the temporal response to the answers?
That they might change.
No, that something has affected the population at that particular time in their response to the answer.
Really good question. Actually, I must go back and look up my data. We did Lake Warden twice with these elicitations, and I'm sure that the very first time we did it, which was straight after the lead poisoning problem, the benign physical and chemical environment came up as quite a high rating. And I think that's about the only time in Western Australia it has. And I think that the second time we came back, it dropped its rating. And I must check it. There is no way around that. But at least with this approach, you can actually repeat it provided your audience is receptive. I mean, one of the things we do with our stakeholders, if we want them to come and do a one-day workshop, then we better get some damn results out in one day, because they're not going to willingly give us many days of time. And that they're not being nasty, that's just their people with great significant demands on their time. So, but you can easily redo it. This sort of a workshop takes about a day to do properly. And I think that one of the advantages we mentioned in the paper is if you wanted to, you could review it every 5 years. And certainly if there's a significant change, you should review it. But the decisions are being made anyway. I should just finish. I just wanted to draw out 2 more points, then come back to it, because these are really good questions. I just wanted to show the difference between their personal perspective and their stakeholder perspective. Now, yes, they could be gaming the system, but it's highly unlikely in the time available that they're playing around gaming the system. I think this reflects the fact that aesthetic pleasure, if you talk to them as a group, you would have got the sense that the aesthetic pleasure they were getting out of the out of the elements in the Thames, they would have rated that value highly important. But you can see from the stakeholders it's not necessarily the case. It's a divided group. even though from their personal perspective, they do think the aesthetic, they personally get a lot of aesthetic value out of the Thames elements. So I think that, to me, I would take that as a good indication that they're clearly separating their roles as a stakeholder and as a person. I'm not naive enough to think that they couldn't game the system, but I think it's unlikely. And then I just wanted to show you the centroids, which is the centre of gravity of those, the diagrams. And you can see if you rank them based on centroids, then the ranking from their stakeholder perspective is quite different from the ranking from their personal perspective. It's all over the place. The only other thing I'd say in closing, second last thing I'd say in closing, is that the point about the temporal change is really very important. And that because people, the reason we're trying to get at values is because they are more enduring than attitudes, much more enduring. But there's no question they change. And the only way I see of dealing with that is to try and work closely with people to make sure they're informed and understanding and they're using a similar language, but also that you need to be able to repeat the exercise at say 5-year intervals or 1-year intervals or whatever. And this process, if it was computerised, would enable you to do that quite easily.
The Thames is interesting because, in fact, government changed policy on safe flooding in that environment, so we've got a change in perspective, if you like.
Yes. The question then becomes, would the values have been stable through that, even though the policy of... Because that's really the management that's changing, the management of the Thames, in the sense. That doesn't necessarily mean their values will change. But well, you'd expect that they will from time to time. Just finally, I just wanted, before we go to general questions, we actually, in an actual elicitation, if you've been a group of stakeholders, the results that come out of your elicitation, we would come back and meet with you, discuss them. Our stakeholders are advisory. They're not making the decision. They're advising, and that's made very clear to them right at the outset. So they're an advisory group. But every time, the 5 times we've done it in the Southwest, we've taken their rankings into the planning process. And we use the values. So we're actually effectively given a set of biological elements that we're told manage those elements in that catchment. So we've got those in a very broad sense. So we then go and do the values analysis with the stakeholders. We take that into our planning process, do the values analysis. The ranking of the values directly affects the goal that we write. The priority values are written directly into the management goal. And then that directly affects how we rank our elements, the biological elements for management. What we're trying to do is work out the utility value for each of the elements in terms of the goal. And then we use that. We then go into a process of looking at what processes we need to manage, which is a key risk factors, feasibility. Then we decide the actions. Monitor and evaluate, get back to the values. That's a planning cycle. Interestingly enough, the management cycle is the reverse, of course. You act on the processes to put the structure and composition of the elements into a status that makes your goals realised and gives you the values you want. And then you monitor and evaluate to make sure that's happened. So, thanks very much.